SNCC. We have 2 ASL interpreters. If you want ASL interpretation, please pin Rodney LeBon before the breakout rooms and Crystal Butler after the breakout sessions. Some of you are joining us for the first time, welcome, and some have participated in one or each of our sessions over the past 3 weeks. Welcome back. I'm Jessica Rucker. I'm a high school teacher based in Washington, D.C., and I regularly use lessons from the Zinn Education Project, which is coordinated by Rethinking Schools and Teaching for Change. They offer free downloadable people histories lessons that you may have used for middle and high school classrooms from the Zinn Education Project website. I am so very happy, to say the very least, to be in conversation today with SNCC veterans Courtland Cox and Judy Richardson. Before Courtland, Judy, and I launch our conversation, we want to find out who is in the room and go through our plans for our time together. We're going to do a quick poll to find out how many teachers, librarians, teacher educators, historians, parents, students, and others are here with us today. Many of you are in multiple roles. Just pick your primary role. An educator, Sierra Kaler Jones, will post a poll for you to respond to. And we might use polls again. Ah, there it is. So take a moment and just pick your primary role. And then click submit. All right, as you continue to make your selections, I'll just keep going. Throughout the session, we want you to use the chat box. Please post questions, comments, resources, and ideas. We'll read your questions and try to respond after the breakout groups. We'll also do a short evaluation at the end. We are now ready to start our conversation. And after, oh, there we go. So 48% of us identify as educators, 26% as students, 1% librarians, 16% teacher educators, 4% identify as historians, and 5% as other. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right. We're now ready to start our conversation. And after about 20 minutes, we'll pause so that you can meet each other and talk and share in small groups to share highlights. But first, I want to say that I met Courtland and Judy through an NEH Summer Teacher Institute at Duke University in 2018. And I was absolutely inspired and humbled to learn from some of the people who made the modern movement for civil rights happen. In the interest of time, I encourage everyone to read Judy and Courtland's bios at sncdigital.org. But before these 2 SNCC veterans jump in, I want to note that Courtland Cox is the chair of the SNCC Legacy Project Board and that Judy Richardson is also a member. All right, let's do one more quick poll and then I'll start posing some questions. So I'm curious, before hearing about this session, had you never heard of SNCC? Heard of SNCC, but don't know much about it? Have studied and or taught about SNCC? Or were you a SNCC volunteer or staff member? I'm looking forward to those responses. As folks make their submissions, Courtland, I am going to start this conversation with you. Let's just give people a few more seconds. And there we have it. So 17% had heard of SNCC, 26% had heard of SNCC, but don't know much about SNCC. 54% have studied or taught about SNCC, and 3% were volunteers or staff members. Excellent. Well, Courtland, let's jump in. For people who are learning about SNCC for the first time, please tell us who and what SNCC is and how and why SNCC got started.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Zinn Education Project for hosting this virtual meeting. And I want to give a shout out to all the teachers, parents, and students in the audience. I put myself down as a historian. Actually, I don't actually teach history, but what I'm going to try to do today is give you my sense of my life from the inside out. So the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I made some notes to refer to, was founded at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina in April 1960. The meeting at Shaw was called by Ms. Ella Baker to provide some coordination and structure to the numerous sit-ins that spread rapidly across the country after the February 1st, 1960 sit-in started in Greensboro, North Carolina. The sit-ins were mostly conducted by students from Negro colleges. We don't refer to them as Negro colleges anymore. They're known as HBCUs. At the SNCC meeting, there were about 126 representatives from 40 Negro colleges and Black high schools. While it may not have been obvious to the students who attended this early SNCC meeting, the SNCC convening at Shaw was the culmination of a series of actions that were taken by civil rights organizers over a 20-year period. Upon reflection, I really consider the founding of SNCC a new phase of a struggle that had been ongoing. While it's difficult for many of you looking at my gray hair and bald head to realize it, in 1960, most members of SNCC were between the ages of 17 and 22. For most of the secondary school teachers in the audience, many, if not most, of the early SNCC members were of the age of your students from last year and the year before. I graduated from high school in the spring of 1959. I arrived as a freshman at Howard University in January 1960. I worked in the post office from June 1959 to January 1960. And you could do that at that point because at Howard University, tuition was $110 a semester, room was $40 a month, and food was $40 a month. I also need to say that my salary was $2.20 an hour. As I think about it now, I was drawn to supporting the sit-in movement in the South and participating in the SNCC sit-in movement in Washington, D.C., because over a 6-year period, starting at the age of 13, I was influenced by several discussions, arguments, and stories that either occurred on the sidewalk or on the baseball field in the Bronx, New York, and Throgsneck projects where I lived. In 1954, I was 13 years old. The sidewalk discussion was about Brown versus the Board of Education. The adults in the projects where I live celebrated the Supreme Court decision, but they celebrated it because Kenneth Clark was involved in the research. And in the conversations that I heard about Brown v. versus Board of Education, nobody talked about Thurgood Marshall or nobody talked about the NAACP. It was all about Kenneth Clark. Because he was a native New Yorker. In 1955, when I was 14 years old, 2 major historical events occurred. The first was the murder of Emmett Till in August of 1955. The second was the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott in December of 1955. As you know, the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott was led by Martin Luther King, Jr., a 26-year-old preacher. He popularized in America the use of the nonviolent teaching of Mahatma Gandhi that was developed in South Africa during the turn of the century and perfected as Gandhi tried to make and bring an end to colonialism in India. The adoption of the nonviolent teaching, his nonviolent teachings, became very, very important as a central operating principle for all of the civil rights movements, including SNCC. In 1957, when I was 16 years old, I witnessed on my 19-inch black and white TV, and there were only 3 major channels at the time, the attempts of 9 Black students to integrate the Little Rock High School in Arkansas. The federal government for the first time had to enforce the laws of the land that were established under Brown versus Board of Education. Therefore, in 1960, many of the students at the Negro colleges who saw on their black and white televisions the ongoing challenges to both de jure and de facto segregation were more than ready to end racial barriers to their lives. So within days of the February 1st sit-ins, other sit-ins spread across the country like wildfire. And 75 days later, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was established to provide better organization and support.
Wow, thank you for that rich social history. And I love what someone in the chat box described as the genealogy of SNCC. One of the points you made, Courtland, was about nonviolent direct action. And so my next question actually is for Judy. I love the role of art and music as a strategy, as a direct action strategy, or elevating direct action strategies. So every movement needs a soundtrack, and SNCC really harnessed the power of freedom songs. Please tell us why freedom songs were so important to the movement.
Yeah, I mean, I love talking about the music because the freedom songs served a number of purposes, and they were really part of the major glue that held us together, right? And so it was, they were songs that made you feel unified, that you could do anything, that no matter what the cops were doing, no matter what these white supremacists were doing, you were together and you were united in song, and your voices, and I couldn't sing, can I tell you? But the main thing was when you lifted your voices in song with all these other people, like you'd be coming out of jail and you'd come into a mass meeting in a church and people would be singing, and it was like nobody could touch you. And there was also a sense of resistance, so that you felt that there's a story that Bernice Johnson Reagan often told, which was, and Bernice, many of you know, was the founder of Sweet Honey in the Rock. But before that, she's a song leader out of Albany, Georgia, in Southwest Georgia. And she's a SNCC staff member. So she's doing the Freedom Singers for SNCC, but she's also organizing within Southwest Georgia. And she talked about how in this rural church in Dougherty County in Southwest Georgia, there's a mass meeting, and it's small because it's always small, at the beginning. And she said they're talking about the business of the movement, and who's gotten arrested, who's gotten beaten in jail, what money maybe have possibly was collected from people to keep the movement going. And then suddenly in the middle of this meeting, the sheriff comes in, and he walks in, white of course, and he has guns on either side of him. And he walks in and he gets to the beginning of the front of the mass meeting in this small rural Black church. And he starts calling them by name. And he says, John, does Mr. Thomas know you're here? And Betty, does Miss Johnson know you're here? To let the Black people in that church know, I, white supremacist sheriff, know who you are, and I'm going to go back and tell your employers. And since everybody was living really on the edge of, near starvation in these rural areas, what that meant is I'm going to lose my job, and I'm going to lose my livelihood, and it's possible that they are going to try and shoot me. So this sheriff is going by and he's saying everybody's name. And then suddenly, somebody at the back of the room starts singing, ain't gonna let nobody turn me right. And suddenly this one voice becomes three voices, so this whole group of the small mass meeting is singing not just for themselves, but singing at the sheriff, because it's a song of resistance. Singing at the sheriff, I know that you have the power of life and death over me, but that's not gonna stop me anymore, right? There is a sense of strength that you got from this music. And so what Bernice often said was, when you looked at the sheriff and he heard the song, she said you could tell by the look on his face that he suddenly realized that the Black people in front of him had changed. They were no longer the scared Black folks that he had been accustomed to being, because he didn't know that some of them might have been in the NAA already. He didn't know any of that. But what he did know is that these folks visibly had changed because of the power of the song. Now, we also used it internally within SNCC. And so I remember when, it was either I think it was around 64 when we had come back from Atlantic City, and, the liberals who we thought were going to support us, they didn't support us because of Lyndon Johnson and a variety of things. But we come back and I realized we're a little trying to figure out what to do now. And sometimes when you don't know what you're doing within a movement, you start internally attacking each other. It becomes, fratricide. And so we were in the middle of this meeting and people are arguing, and they're arguing in a way that I'm not sure I think the organization will survive. And so suddenly Jim Foreman, our executive secretary, who by the way, also couldn't sing that great, he suddenly starts singing, "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" And he's singing this, and I'm thinking, these folks aren't going to sing like they used to. We're beyond that. People are too mad at each other. They're just going to let him sing by himself and be quiet. And suddenly, Gene Smith starts singing, so-and-so starts singing. They start singing. And what it did is it reminded us who we were, what we had meant one to the other. All the history that we had been through together. And suddenly, all the staff meeting is singing, "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" And it reminded us of what we had always talked about, which was that we were a band of brothers and sisters in a circle of trust. And that's why, 60 years later, we're still doing what we're doing. And it's because of that unity, but the song was so important to that.
Goodness gracious, I'm getting chills over here. Thank you so much. And gosh, so now I want to transition a little bit. The song is such an incredible bridge. There's this awesome book that I got in 2018 at the NEH Institute. I want you, Judy, I want to keep sticking with your stories here. Tell us about SNCC moving the national office to Greenwood, Mississippi, and the people that you encountered who were already organizing in Greenwood. And I'm really interested about June Johnson and the incident with Silas McGee.
Yes, indeed. Well, SNCC decide to move a portion of the national office, which had been in Atlanta, to Greenwood, Mississippi. And so, for example, Betty Garman Robinson, then Betty Garman, comes down with the Friends of SNCC. Julian Bond comes down, who was head of communications. John Lewis is traveling around. Stokely is already there. Courtland's already there. We have all these people. So part of the office, though, moves down to Greenwood. And just to know that, when Bob Moses, who was our main person and the main leader within the Mississippi movement for SNCC, when he goes into Mississippi in 1961 and then really beds in 1962, what he's guided by is Amzie Moore. And I'll tell you about that at some other point. But what Amzie talks to him about is, look, you young people, he says to Bob, and Bob has said this, Bob says, when he goes in 62, Amzie lays out a precinct map. And Amzie at that point is in Cleveland, Mississippi. Lays out a precinct map on his kitchen table in Cleveland, Mississippi, and says, look, you young people can do sit-ins if you want to, but I know that our power as Black people will be around the right to vote. Now, Amzie knew this because he had been part of this Regional Council of Negro Leadership, these returning Black World War II vets, like Medgar Evers, like Amzie, and they had formed around economic justice, around voting rights, around a lot of different issues in 1951. They had a meeting of 15,000 Black folks in Mount Bayou, Mississippi. I couldn't believe it, but that's another story. So Bob is sitting there with Amzie, who is, as most of the local people were doing for us, they are guiding and guarding us with their guns. And so Amzie puts out this precinct map and says, look, this is where the concentration of Black people are. This is where we've been working all this time. And he said, but I'm not ready for you here yet. I don't have the organization here in Cleveland yet, but C.C. Bryant has it for you down in Southwest Mississippi. which is why the first real voting rights project happens down in Southwest Mississippi. But when I go there, it's 1964, right? And so what I'm coming into is something that has been going on for some time. And what I find is that, for example, there are the Greens. And so that's Freddie and George Green, who become SNCC staff members. Their family was a strong family. June Johnson's family was a strong family in Greenwood. And I might say, by the way, Stokely used to stay with Freddie and George's family. So when I get down there, now, you know, intellectually, you can know that people want to shoot you. You know that, because but to actually be in a position where they really try and do that is like, what? You know, I mean, I'm coming from Tarrytown, New York, you know, I mean, please. So, so what happens is that I'm sitting there in 1964, it's Freedom Summer. Those three particular civil rights workers were missing. We knew they were dead, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, but their bodies had not yet been found. So at some point, June Johnson, the strong 15-year-old from Greenwood, Mississippi, runs in to the SNCC office. I had the keys to one of the SNCC cars, and because we had this auto fleet called the Sojourner Auto Fleet. And so I had one of the keys, and she says, we got to go down to the hospital because the McGee brothers had just earlier that day tried to integrate 64. So it's supposed to be the Civil Rights Act, and, you know, it's supposed to be, well, no, that's not true. So they had tried to integrate a movie theater. And so when Silas comes out, one of the brothers, he sits in the car and some white racist throws a rock through the window and glass gets in his eyes. So he is now at the segregated hospital in Greenwood. So June comes, again, strong family. She had been working since long before I got to Greenwood. And she says, we got to go because, they're at the hospital. So we get in the car, I, June, two other people, I'm driving. And at some point, this car comes on the side of us and says, a white couple. And they start motioning and doing things that I can't remember, but to indicate that they are not our friends. And so June says to me, speed up. Now, I had in my mind, you don't go over the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit because then they will arrest you for speeding. Then we hear sounds. And June says, hurry up, they're shooting at us. And I said, oh, no, June, that's just a backfire. Now, June is from Greenwood, right? You would think I would listen to her. Okay, so we get there, and it's the Greenwood Hospital. There's this, small white mob with some brickbats and stuff. We run from the car into the Greenwood Hospital, and I see 6 FBI men. And they are seated on the floor. And no, at that point, they're walking around the there's a picture window. And so they are walking around the reception area. And so I run in, June immediately goes in the back to find out how Silas is doing. And I see these, this 6, all white, of course, FBI men. And then somebody throws something through the window, this picture window in the hospital reception area. And we all run behind this wall, including the FBI men. And then they sit, that's when they get seated, all 6 of them. And I start thinking, this is like the monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil people. And I start screaming. Now, I knew that the FBI did nothing. All they ever did was to take notes. They could see horrible infringements of federal law, they would do nothing. So I start screaming like a crazy person. I was like, what are you doing? Why don't you do something? By the way, there really is an advantage to righteous anger. It's not everything, nonviolent. No, I was pissed. Okay, so, and then I had my little dimes because nobody had cell phones. So what you did is that you went then, I peeked around, and June still remembered that. She said, yes, you peeked around and you went to the hall, the little payphone in the reception area, and I started putting dimes in to call John Doerr, who was the most wonderful person in the Justice Department, in the administration. And I kept calling. And then finally, because of the calling and because I was talking to foremen and I was talking to everybody through these little dimes. By the way, I should mention the FBI guys never came out from behind the barricade, but okay. And so eventually, because of the pressure, and because we're calling the Friends of SNCC and the student campus Friends of SNCC, our network, because we had a network, already existing. And because of that, there's pressure being put on the local sheriff because our offices have given the number of the sheriff. He comes, the white sheriff, and he comes and he escorts us out. So for me, it was, first of all, you need to listen to local people because they actually know what they're talking about. Don't think you know what you're doing. But it was also the sense that we had a network that was looking at us, that was helping us in addition to the local movement that was there.
Yeah, thank you again. As I'm listening to you share these stories, I'm thinking about my role as a teacher and as an African-American woman here in DC. And what keeps coming up for me over and over is the ways in which you are humanizing this movement. You are a real person. These were real people. These are real issues, and these are real changes. And I think the more I can translate that for students, the more this history sticks. And so I have a million follow-up questions, but I want to switch gears and I want to kick it back to Courtland, because I want to pick up here where SNCC is doing grassroots work with local people, honoring the voices of people who'd already been doing base building work. So this is the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment and also an election year. Courtland, tell us how and why SNCC focused on voting rights in Loudoun County, Alabama. And then I'm also interested in who were some of the local people you all work with while organizing there. And let's start there.
Okay, so Judy mentioned that the sheriff came into the mass meeting and thought that he had license to exercise power in Mississippi. And we have to remember Loudoun County came after Mississippi. So by the time we got to Loudoun County in Alabama, we had a very different attitude about how we began to look at the issue of power. So Loudoun County was 80% African-American, but there were no registered voters in Loudoun County. So we decided that, it's one thing to go about talking about registering to vote, but the real issue, given Judy's example, is about power. And there are three questions around that. The first is who should have it, who should exercise it, and who should benefit from it. Those are the three questions that we had. But the issue was a problem. Okay, so you now have a population of 80% African Americans, but they're being treated and brutalized by the political establishment. So, I mean, as opposed to going to protest as we usually did in the past and calling people, we decided, okay, it's now time to exercise power. But the trick was, how do you now get people who had never voted to believe that they not only could vote, but run a county, be the sheriff, be the tax assessor, be the tax collector, be the probate judge, and so forth. So we decided, and Jennifer Lawson and Judy and Stokely and Willie Ricks and Frau Featherstone, a bunch of, and got together and went in there. And fortunately, we had Jack Menace, who was a genius in terms of research. And he found out how we could probably answer this question. Loudoun County, the state of Alabama, had a law that said that you could establish a political party just on the county level. So we said, okay, we have 80% of the vote, we need to have 80% of the power. How do we go about this? So the first thing we decided to do was educate the population. And what we did, we know that we knew that we couldn't have great tracks to educate people. So what we did was we developed comic books. And the comic books, we had several comic books. One comic book talked about what is had the picture of Mr. Logan, and what were the responsibilities of the sheriff. The other is Board of Education. What were the such responsibilities of the Board of Education? We had the picture of everybody who was running for that office on there so that people could see in fact the person who they were supporting. So that because we had two big problems, we had to educate people about what the responsibilities were, but probably the bigger problem was to get them to believe that they could do it. They themselves, given all the things that they had suffered all through these years, they had to believe themselves that they could do it. So we did two kinds of comics. One that had the statistics and facts, and the other was another one we call Us Colored People. And I got that, and we developed that, Jennifer Lawson and myself, because again, in Mississippi, listening to the people, a woman in a mass meeting in Mississippi got up and she said, us colored people have been using our mouths to do two things, to eat and say yassa. It's time we said no. So we took that whole story and we created a comic book. The next problem that we had and we tried to solve was that, given a lot of people could not read and there was literacy rate was pretty high in Lowndes County, how would you get people to vote correctly? How do you get them to vote for the right person? So we decided to do what was done in a lot of places already. Get a symbol. The Democrats in Alabama already had a symbol. It was a rooster, and it said "for the right" on the top of the rooster, and on the bottom, white supremacy. So we decided we were going to get a symbol, and that symbol was the Black Panther. And I mean, we actually were trying to find a mascot, and we asked our people in Atlanta, and Ruth Howard, and I think it's the mascot, a symbol of Morris Brown in Atlanta. And so my sense is we liked the Black Panther because it showed strength and it was big and people could identify with it. So at the end of the day, what we were able to do was get people with their individual votes to act in a mass fashion. So we created the tagline, I guess it's called a tagline now, vote for the Black Panther and then go home. So that people were able as individuals to act in such a direction that they were able to exercise power. Now, I think when I look at it is that I think the Lowndes County experience and this whole exercise of power had reverberations way beyond what happened in Lowndes County. We can talk later about its importance to the call for Black Power by Stokely and the formation of the Black Panther Party in California. But at the end of the day, when we look at Lowndes County, if you were going to sum it up, we were intent on regime change. We were going to make sure that the sheriff who dealt with the people in Lowndes County, we didn't have to ask them to be nice because the sheriff was going to be somebody from that community who understood the needs of that community.
Oh my goodness. Whew.
Can I just,
Courtland, wow, this is so powerful. And I just want to recap a couple things and then we're going to go into breakout rooms. So as a teacher, again, I'm wearing my teacher hat. I'm thinking about the consciousness raising that you all were doing and also confidence building through using popular education strategies. As a teacher, differentiation is so important. I got to, start where students are and honor the knowledge that they bring in the classrooms. The political education and then the use of the Black Panther. So using culturally relevant content to ground my teaching is so important. And then also base building through the use of slogans. When I offer students bite-sized processes to engage in the learning, we can go deeper and deeper. And it's so powerful to see the parallels between the community organizing work of SNCC and then the work I get to do as a classroom teacher in DC. So we are going to pause so that you can meet some of your fellow participants and process what you have been hearing. Now, please do not drop off for two reasons. One, there are going to be some great people in these breakout sessions. And two, you'll get to hear more from Judy and Courtland when we return. And in fact, this time, after the breakout sessions, they're going to be answering your questions. We're going to automatically place you in breakout groups of 5 or 6. If any of you want to leave and return to the main room, you can. Once in small groups, please introduce yourself and say where you're from. Now, in some groups, there will be a Zinn Education Project teacher volunteer who will introduce themselves and facilitate. But given the size of this group, we might not have a facilitator for every breakout room. And if there is not one in yours, we ask that the person with the first letter of their first name closest to the beginning of the alphabet start, and then pick the next person, and so on. Now, you only have 10 minutes, so please quickly introduce yourselves, your name, where you're from, and your role, and then have an open discussion about what ideas you got from learning about SNCC that could be applied to the challenges that we're facing today, how you'll use what you just learned, or for teachers, how you can include this learning in your lessons. And then if you have time, share any insights or ideas you've had from the presentation. And please try to make sure everybody gets a chance to talk. We'll give you a 60-second alert when it's time to return to the full group, and you will be returned automatically. And before we go into the groups, I want to offer an equity consideration. Make sure everyone has spoken or shared before you share again. And we will see you back around 2:45. All right? All right. I'd like to briefly share 2 additional resources. And these are both resources that I've used in my classroom and love a whole lot. The first is Zinn Education Project. There's a series of great lessons. There's one in particular called SNCC Role Play, which was developed by Adam Sanchez. So shout outs to Adam and the Zinn Education Project. And then the second resource is the SNCC Digital Gateway, an incredible resource that includes various primary sources. And when I can't talk to Judy and Courtland directly, I just go to that site. These resources and resources shared via the chat box will be available after today's session via the Zinn Education Project website. So let's get back into some questions. So Judy, I want to start with you. Some teachers, students, activists, and organizers feel that we are working in conditions that seem impossible. Can you tell us about the production of the 14-hour documentary series, Eyes on the Prize? How did it differ from previous documentaries, and what did it teach you about creating something that had not existed before?
Perfect question. When I first start, it's 1979, and we think I'm at Blackside in Boston, Black-owned film company that had never done anything for broadcast, headed by Henry Hampton. And so he brings me up as the first staff person in 1979. And at that point, we think we're doing a 1-hour documentary. And so I'm sitting there by myself looking through research. And I finally find the name of, I'm looking through Stride Toward Freedom, Dr. King's account of the bus boycott, Montgomery bus boycott. And I find the name of Joanne Robinson, head of the Women's Political Council. And I'm so amazed that I've got that, I'm finally finding the name of a woman, because most of the documents did not mention women. And so I try and find her, and that's a whole other thing through one of the first Black journalists at the New York Times, Gerald Fraser, because I'm trying to figure out how do I find her. He says, well, you know, sometimes people are listed in the phone book. So I finally get her through the phone book in LA, and she is so excited to tell me this story because no one has asked her about it. And she talks about how, you know, she's co-chair of the Women's Political Council with Mrs. Mary Fair Burks and da-da-da-da-da. All of that we now know, but back then in 1979, nobody knew about her except for the people of the boycott. And what was amazing to me is that having come from what we all knew was a regular people's movement. It was your aunts and your uncles and your clergy sometimes, and you know, whoever was in your community, they were the ones who were part of this movement. And so that was not in anything that I was seeing in 1979. So the only film at that point was Montgomery to Memphis, which is Dr. King 24/7. So even when he goes into Birmingham, you don't see Reverend Shuttlesworth, you only see Dr. King. Wherever he goes, the focus is only Dr. King, not the strong local leadership that might have been there before he gets there, like in Selma, you know, with Mr. and Mrs. Boynton. So, so I'm not seeing anything that reflects the experience, the on the ground experience that I've come out of from being in SNCC. And see, the danger of that is if you don't know that it's people just like you and your families and all these other people around you, that they were the ones who made and, oh, I'm hearing, am I in an echo? I'm so sorry. Okay, but who made and continue the movement. If you don't know it's people just like you who did this, then you don't know you can do it again. And then all those other crazy people, they win. So what EYES does, and it breaks with what is out there already, when we come on with the first 6 hours in 1987, even at that point, we didn't have Charles Payne's wonderful book, I've Got the Light of Freedom. We didn't have John Dittmer's Mississippi movement, Oranges of Organizing. We didn't have any local movement history at that point. So what EYES does is it opens it up. It shows it's people just like you who made and sustained the movement. And so you see Amzie Moore, and you see E.D. Nixon, and you see all of these regular people, and you see women in leadership, and you see young people in leadership. And it's the first time that you have seen this in anything at that point. That's 1987 with the first 6 hours. The other thing you get is a sense of how long things take. Now, because films are films, you don't get enough of a sense of that. But certainly one of the things that we try and say, even in Montgomery, is, okay, how long have they been marching? Okay, now it's 3 months, now it's 6 months, now it's, the point being that sometimes you'll be in a room, like a mass meeting, and I'll have people come to me, young people now, who will say, what are we doing wrong? You know, you had mass meetings of 300 people, you know, overnight. Well, the point is, and you see that in Montgomery, 381 days they were walking. They didn't take public transport for 381 days. And they stayed together for that amount of time. So for us, you know, mass meetings could be you, your co-organizer, and her mother. That was the mass meeting. And it could be that way for 6 months, could be a year. You never knew whether something was going to break out. And that's important for young organizers today, because sometimes they think they're doing something wrong because they have a sense that all this happened overnight. And the other part is, you never knew whether it was going to work. Nobody knew Montgomery was going to really work and they were going to be able to break the back of the bus system. You don't know. So I think what EYES does is it talks about regular people. It talks about all the folks who were in the leadership. And it talks about how long and how big that opposition is. And it's not only in the white community, because sometimes it's coming from the churches, it's coming from the Black businesses, it's coming from a lot of different areas. So what EYES does is it gives you a sense of what that initial struggle was. And then the next hours, 8 hours, are really about the continuing movement.
Wow, and thank you. And some of what I'm gathering is that there's no spontaneous combustion. That's one of those movement myths. And there's no superheroes. One point that I want to carry over from a previous, one of the previous Friday sessions was that young people carried a lot of power, but some of the choices that youth were making were not always considered popular at the time. So some of the feedback that some of my students get when they want to organize and take direct action is kind of like, y'all are too loud, you're too raucous, you don't know what you're doing. And I think there's some historical amnesia that comes with just the long history, and that it's ordinary people who are capable of extraordinary things, but that are often met with complex opposition, and the resistance has to be just as strategic and as savvy and as patient as well. I want to kick over to a question for Mr. Cox. So 2020 marks the 60th anniversary of the founding of SNCC, and this month SNCC was scheduled to host a historic 60th anniversary convening with movement veterans, current activists and organizers, teachers, students, and other justice-oriented folks. Can you tell us how you're moving the convening online and what the plans are for 2021?
Courtland, is your mic on?
I'm going to ask Courtland to unmute his mic. Yep, we can hear you now. And for other folks, if you forgot to remute your mic, please remute.
Okay. So let's start with the beginning. The convening, the SNCC 60th convening will be held on June 3rd through 5th, 2021. So you can put it on your calendars, and I must say, COVID-19 permitting, I would have that. So right now, so we have done that. So we have now rescheduled it June 3rd through 5th, 2021. I think one of the things that we found out because we had to postpone the meeting is, and it kind of surprised us, because we had a lot of people reaching out to us, young people from today saying, all right, you can't do it and we couldn't come, but let's get together to do virtual meetings in the meantime. And, you know, one of the things that I've learned, you know, and it's very hard to understand, for most SNCC people, they never really see themselves the way people see them. The way you look from the inside out, you're just living your life. From the outside in, you're creating history. So sometimes it's really hard to connect those two worlds. So, I mean, we were really taken back when people said, you know, we got Ashley Henderson from Highlander calling and said, well, let's do, you know, a virtual meeting on the 21st. You know, we've got Organizing Black in Baltimore, BYP 100, and Bo. We're doing something together next Monday on the 27th at 6:30. We're not working with Woke Vote to do something on Juneteenth. So my sense is we're getting a lot of people saying we were coming to this convening, the 60th, not because it was something to do. It was because we had vested interest and understanding of what you were trying to do. And as somebody said, there was a certain authenticity to what, you know, you did and what you are doing over the years. Now, one of the things that, talking about young people, one of the things that we've learned, and I learned early on, and it's really, really hard for young people to understand, because we felt, and every young person feels, that because if I put my energy and if I put my time and if I really want it to happen, it will happen. And given the things that we're dealing with, you find out that everything that you do was necessary, but it will not be sufficient. We have been out here for 60 years, and we have done things, and we've continued to do things for 60 years. And we have done everything that we could accomplish, but we know we have much more to do. So I think one of the things, besides understanding that change is not made by a majority, it's made by the minority. There are a couple other things we have to understand is that even if we try to do, I mean, clearly big things have changed since Judy and I got out there. I mean, we don't have to deal with the kind of things that Judy mentioned. A sheriff if a sheriff walked into a meeting of Black people and started talking like that sheriff talked and Judy talked about, the Black people start laughing at him. They wouldn't be scared of him. So lots that has changed. But we look and see what has happened in the Congress today, where people who have power control trillions of dollars, and it goes to themselves. And the people on the front lines, the workers and the people who have, who are facing COVID day by day, get little resources, have to fight for resources. You have in the $2.2 trillion, you have $170 billion going to real estate developers and going to people who are hedge fund managers, and people who are on the front lines can't get masks to do stuff. So my sense is the struggle continues in a different form. Everybody has to understand the number of things. First, one, the minority makes the difference because they have a view of where they're going. Two, as you try to do it, don't matter how much you wish, don't matter what you think, you will, and everything that you do is necessary, a lot of it will not be sufficient. You have to continue over the years. It's going to be an ongoing struggle. So you should not get frustrated because, again, as King used to say all the time, the arc of the universe is long, but at least we think it bends towards justice.
Thank you. Thank you. Our session today goes until 3:15, but if you have to sign off earlier than that, there is a link in the chat box to the evaluation for today's session. So we had a question about teaching power. Well, first, please fill out that evaluation. If you have to leave early, let me slow down and say that. And then second, the Panther that we talked about was actually from Clark College, before it was Clark University, before it became Clark Atlanta. So we wanted to share that. And then we had a question about teaching about power. As teachers, what would you want teachers to teach about power based on your lived experiences? And if you could give us like the microwave version and not the conventional oven, because we got a couple other questions too.
Yeah. My sense is, one of the persons, a teacher, and Judy mentioned Bob Moses. It seems to me that the most important thing about power is that the kids understand that they have it themselves, as they're the ones who are the best educators. And not only that, they are the ones who challenge each other to get better. So, the best thing a teacher can do about power is to show the student that they have it within themselves to exercise it.
I would just add to that, because that's perfect, that as much as you can show visual stuff, and that's just because I come out of visual stuff, that it helps. One of my favorite films is Freedom Song with Danny Glover and Loretta Devine, and it's about what happens when SNCC moves into Southwest Mississippi. It's a wonderful, wonderful movie, but you see young people taking it and taking the power. So you see it. It's not just, somebody telling you about it.
Another question, and this one is for you, Judy. Would you be able to share your perspective, your perspective on the SNCC position paper on women in the movement? And this person was just wondering about your reflections on that document.
Mm-hmm. I remember it. It happened, we were at Waveland, and so it was right after the 64 thing, what happened in 64 at Atlantic City. I will say, and I possibly was unusual with this, the person I was going with, Ivanhoe Donaldson, showed it to me, gave it to me, and he said very seriously, he was in no way dismissing it. And he said, "What do you think of this?" And I read it, and it didn't seem to me to apply to me, because at that point, my main thing was racism. We were getting killed not because we were women, but because we were Black. And so that was, now some of that had, changed, but at that point it was, we've got to stay together. And I think for a lot of the Black women in the organization, they didn't quite see it in the same way that some of the new white staff members, white female staff members might have seen it. Although not all of them were. So Mary King certainly had been there before I got there. And, and Casey had been there before I got there, both white women. But I will say, I think the reaction to it was a little different based on the race of the woman who was looking at it. Now, I will say, sexism is real. And so there were things that I had to fight against, but most of that comes after I leave the organization. And you will hear it in Hands on the Freedom Plow. Most of the Black women who are in that 52 women anthology, the Black women will talk about how they felt the most powerful as they have felt in their lives when they were in SNCC and supported. Didn't mean there was no sexism, just meant it was so less. And because we were young people, we just the guys were different. They had Miss Baker, it was Diane Nash. It was all these women who were leaders of sit-in movements who were part of the leadership in SNCC. So not that there was no sexism, just that it was different.
So this has been a very rich conversation. Before we wrap up, again, one more plug, please complete that evaluation if you have to leave us before 3:15 EST or 12:15 PST. But I wanted to ask Courtland and Judy, if you have any closing remarks that you want to make, or if there's anything else participants should know about SNCC from your perspective.
Yeah, I want to thank the Zinn Education Project, because it seems to me they are very valuable. At this point in our lives, Judy and I are the wholesale people. We have bundled of stuff, but you are the retail. You bring it to the students. You are the ones who make what we do real and make it alive. So I think the support for what you're doing and particularly the framing and getting teachers together is particularly important, because, as I said, the sense of knowledge and the sense of understanding and the sense of clarity is going to make the difference for the next generations. And one of the things, as you see we're doing, is we are, as Ms. Baker did, we are emphasizing the continuing discussion, we're continuing the multi-generational discussion, and the Zinn Education Project is key to that discussion.
And I would just say two things. One is that SNCC people donate to Zinn Ed. I mean, that's the thing. One of our SNCC Legacy board members put up a challenge to get the new book, and Deborah can remind me what that is, Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, to get that reprinted. Because even as little money as we SNCC people have, this is one of those groups that we donate to, because it is so urgent in terms of making the new generation of people who understand what this history is and how it relates to them. I will say one last thing, that if the one final thing that I always like to end with was something we knew, which was that it relates to what Courtland said, necessary but not sufficient. But what we understood is that if you do nothing, nothing changes for the better. If you do nothing, nothing changes.
Wow, this has been a true treat. I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. And again, we want your feedback on this session, both on the content and the format. That link is in the chat box. But before you get into the evaluation, because we want to leave a few minutes of silent think time, or we'll have some music, I would love you to unmute yourselves and share your thank yous and your gratitudes, both to each other, but also like as people. Uh-oh, Siri's trying to get involved. That was weird. Thank each other as people's teachers of people's history, but then also give a thank you to our special guests, Judy and Courtland. So please unmute yourselves share some love.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so
This was
much.
awesome. So inspiring.
Appreciate you.
So we love
Appreciate
you.
you.
Stay safe, stay healthy.
Great questions, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy and Courtland. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Yay.
Love,
Courtland.
much
Good
love.
job, Jessica.
And my
Wonderful to talk with you all.
cool.
great job, Jessica.
Thank you.
Very
Go,
inspiring, Judy.
Jessica.
Thank you.
Thanks to
so
our interpreters
lovely.
as well.
Yes. Thank you, Zinn Ed.
Thank you.
Rodney.
Thank you.
Interpreters. Everyone that was in my breakout session.
Yes.
It means a lot to hear it from the source.
Yes.
We
Jessica,
shall
thank you, Deborah.
overcome.
Thank you, Zinn Education staff.
All right, we're gonna complete this evaluation in style. We're gonna have some music by the SNCC Freedom Singers.
All right.
And let's go ahead and get that playing. And we love your feedback. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Next
Jessica.
Friday.
Where